everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of Conservative Conversations with ISI. My name is Jacob Lane, and in addition to acting as this evening's moderator, I have the privilege of serving as ISI's Director of External Relations. With the election less than 1 week away, we thought it would be a timely idea to provide an inside look at the American presidency through the eyes of those who have served as advisors in the White House. In this case, both the Trump and Reagan presidencies. After all, few presidencies have loomed so large in the American conservative movement as those of Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. Tonight, it's my hope that our two guests, both esteemed and lifelong politicos, will help us explore their legacies. Our first guest is no stranger to ISI. From 1971 to 1977, Mr. T. Kenneth Cribb Jr. served as the National Director for ISI. He later became President of ISI, a role he remained in for over 20 years. But prior to his days as President of ISI, Ken was actively involved in national politics. In the early days of the 1980 Reagan campaign, he was deputy to the chief counsel. He went on to serve the Reagan administration for almost the entire 8 years of its existence, beginning in 1981 as Assistant Director for the Office of Cabinet Affairs. He served next as Assistant Counselor to the President, in which capacity he assisted Counselor Edwin Meese. When Mr. Meese became Attorney General, Ken accompanied him to the Justice Department, where he became Counselor to the Attorney General. In 1987, Ken returned to the White House as Assistant to the President for Domestic Affairs, serving as President Reagan's top advisor on domestic matters and supervising 4 White House offices: policy development, cabinet affairs, public liaison, and welfare reform. He served in this position until the fall of 1988. Just as Ken is no stranger to the ISI community, our second guest is no stranger in GOP politics. Prior to joining President Trump's administration in 2017, Dr. Paul Teller served as a Capitol Hill staffer for 16 years, including as the Deputy Chief of Staff and later Chief of Staff for Senator Ted Cruz, Legislative Director, Policy Director, and then Executive Director for the Republican Study Committee under a whopping 7 chairmen, including a certain Mike Pence, and a professional staff member on the Committee on House Administration. Soon after taking office, President Trump named Paul as a special assistant to the president for legislative affairs, where he operated as the White House liaison to the U.S. House of Representatives, to U.S. Senate conservatives, and to all the groups and activists of the conservative movement. In March 2020, Paul became Deputy Assistant to the President and Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Vice President, where he currently serves as the VP's liaison to the conservative movement at large. Welcome to both of you, and thank you for joining us this evening. Especially Paul, I can only imagine how crazy things are with the election only 6 days away. And unlike the last presidential debate, I don't have a mute button at my disposal. I'm counting on tonight's guests to be on their best behavior. So I don't think that's going to be much of an issue tonight.
No.
Throughout the webinar, if you would like to ask either or both of our guests a question, please feel free to submit one using the Q&A tab located on the right side of your screen. I will try and get to as many audience questions as possible. Also, please feel free to make comments and engage in conversation with other attendees using the chat box. So with that, let's kick things off. And I'm going to ask both of you sort of a softball question to start us off. How did you get into the White House? And how long were you there? Or in Paul's case, how long have you been with the administration? Let's start with that. How you got in. Let's start with Ken.
Well, since this is an ISI audience, and by the way, thank you, Jacob, for hosting this. And, ISI, I'm a child of ISI. I was a mere political conservative before ISI put The Conservative Mind by Russell Kirk in my hands when I was a freshman in college. And I've been immensely rewarded by every interaction and hope this will be the same and expect this to be the same. And Paul and I are good friends and allies. We're on the phone with each other every Wednesday morning.
Absolutely.
And it's like, and I see that both Ed Fulner and Ed Meese have just joined the audience. And so the two Eds will feel free to correct me when I err. They've done it before. All right. So, look, since it's an ISI audience, there are plenty of good Tories in that audience. And Tories believe that there's accident in history. And my entry into politics is definitely one of the accidents of history, because I was minding my own business, had just started at a Wall Street firm, and had some time coming up for vacation in 1980. But that was the big one, This was Reagan's on the cusp of Reagan presidency. That would have been the first successful. If it had been successful, the first since Coolidge. So I knew it was the big one, and I was feeling guilty about the vacation. So I called up Loren Smith. Loren was a good ISI man and was the chief counsel of both the 76 and 80 Reagan campaigns. I said, now, Loren, I'm getting ready to go to Italy, and I want to go to Italy, but I'm feeling guilty about it. And if you need me, I'll work for $1. But if you don't need me, I'd really like to go to Italy. And he says, can you get here tomorrow? And I said, Loren, tomorrow is Sunday, but I can get there Monday. And then I never left. And then even my getting to the White House, that was the campaign. I'm a deputy to the chief counsel. But then they asked me to stay for the transition, where I had justice and the regulatory agencies, about 20 teams. And then Ed Meese says to me, now, Ken, don't take a job from anybody else before you talk to me about the White House. I said, all right, Ed. Then he disappeared. He was piling around with the president-elect, and he never came back to the transition headquarters. And so my credentials were running out. How would I get into the White House for this famous appointment? But so his aide told me that he would be changing into his monkey suit for the inauguration. And so I ambushed him. I was there. When he got there at 7:00, I was already there. And Ed, you told me not to take a job from anybody, but then you disappeared. He said, all right, I remember. He says, all you have to do is call this number and they'll give you some credentials. And so then Ed got me in where he wanted me, which was in the cabinet office. And then I later went directly to work for him and stayed, as Jacob said, stayed the rest of the administration.
Nice. How about you, Paul?
Well, I guess it's because back just not too long ago, but 2016 was privileged to be chief of staff for Ted Cruz, as you mentioned. And you might remember Ted Cruz ran for president, came in second. And then I guess it was about the summer, somewhere in there, late spring, early summer of 2016, the senator actually asked me to leave the Senate office to go help him start what a lot of ex-presidential candidates do, start some sort of outside group, a nonprofit, not a campaign organization, but some sort of nonprofit that would, basically keep his grassroots network that he had just built across 50 states, keep that network warm, seed it with ideas, with connections, with, promoting Ted Cruz and his allies, our allies in the movement, things like that. So that's what happened. I left the Senate office, was working with a few other Ted Cruz allies, to build out, we were actually going to have a C3 and a C4 that was going to kind of unofficially be the Ted Cruz in waiting organization for a presidential run in 2020. Obviously, all predicated on Hillary Clinton winning in 2016. So when Hillary Clinton thankfully did not win in 2016, Donald Trump won in 2020, we looked at ourselves in this organization that we were building that we hadn't even announced yet. We were waiting until after the 2016 election. Said, can we really do this anymore? How do we have a kind of a Ted Cruz in waiting organization when our party's candidate actually won despite expectations? So we quickly said, yeah, we can't do that. We've all got to look for other things to do. And I said, well, maybe I should consider the administration, maybe even the White House. Would they take a Ted Cruz guy? As you may remember, Ted Cruz and Donald Trump weren't the best of buddies during the 2016 race. So would they really take a Ted Cruz guy in? So I figured, all right, how do I figure this out? How do I poke around? Jacob, as you mentioned before, I had previously worked for then Congressman Mike Pence when he was chairman of the Republican Study Committee back in 2005, 2006. So I called up some old Pence staffers who were kind of still in the orbit, just kind of felt things out. What do you think? What do you think? And they said, absolutely. We're taking people into the Trump administration from all kinds of campaigns. And obviously, you know that to be true. Pretty much almost every campaign wound up having some people taken into the Trump administration. Wound up sitting down with Mike Pence himself when he was vice president-elect and just said, what do you think? And we talked about just different opportunities, different possibilities. We came up with this kind of hybrid position where I'm in leg affairs and obviously doing legislative affairs work, but not just House or Senate like most staffers would do. I would do House and Senate, but just conservatives. And I would work with the outside groups that help advance the president's legislative agenda, work with conservatives kind of from the outside vantage point. So that was my entree via Ted Cruz and Mike Pence, and started 6 days in, January 26, 2017. And I remember at the time feeling very behind because I wasn't on the campaign. I wasn't in the transition. I wasn't at the inauguration or any of the cool parties. And here I started 6 days in thinking I was just, oh my God, I'm one of the last ones to be hired, only to walk in the door and realize the building was still mostly empty, for reasons we can get into. But that was basically the story. And before I forget, let me also thank ISI for tonight. Jacob, thank you so much. By the way, to whoever brought Johnny Burka on at ISI, what a huge score. That's a great win for the conservative movement. He's a fantastic guy. I look forward to partnering with him, collaborating with him, and a great honor to be on with Ken Cribb, legend of the conservative movement tonight. I will definitely be enjoying our time together tonight.
Well, and as Ken mentioned, Ed Follner is listening, so you can thank Ed.
That makes me nervous. I wish I didn't know that.
He's on our board, so thank you, Dr. Follner. Well, let's jump in to our next question then. Now let's end the softball ones. We ended the pleasantries now, so let's get into the hard stuff. While there are obviously many similarities between Presidents Trump and Reagan, including the famous "Make America Great Again" slogan. I know some people on the Trump campaign didn't want to admit that. That did come from Reagan. Both were also seen by many as outsiders within the GOP. And also they both came from entertainment backgrounds, with Reagan being a movie star and Trump being a television personality. Was the Trump administration built using Reagan's administration as a blueprint? And we'll start with Ken on that.
I think rarely in history do you get something with that exact degree of parallelism. I think there was a great deal in common, and I think that's what we'll be talking about all night. But I do think that they saw some of the very important issues the same way, and even occasionally turned to some of the same people to work on those issues. I'll give you the example of judicial selection. Both Ed Meese and Ed Follner were in the Trump transition. I was asked to be, but I had a relative that was ill, and that I needed not to leave South Carolina. But I joined and did my work on the judicial selection process from South Carolina. And so in judicial selection, candidate Trump in those days when Paul was working for Ted and all of us had various candidates, he made a decisive intervention in that campaign when he said, I know the conservatives don't think I know about picking judges. They're right. I don't. If the Heritage Foundation and the Federalist Society will draw up a good list, I'll pick from that. He got my support that day. And I'm probably not the only one, so I understand. And I thought our job collectively would be to hold a politician to that kind of promise. No, he's been as good as his word. He has faithfully selected from the list. It has been negotiated. It has been enlarged three times, but those enlargements have been negotiated. And so you could throw a dart and get a good justice off that list. And so that's an example of where it's not exactly a blueprint. They say that history, whether or not history repeats itself, it does rhyme.
Like that. Paul?
I like that. That's great. Yeah, no, I associate myself with the gentleman's comments. And I think, frankly, it goes back also to one of the points I was just making, too, is how in the Trump administration, I think we took a Reagan model of trying to bring people together. In other words, you win the election and then you bring folks from different parts of politics, different people with different loyalties. Because again, in the Trump White House, to this day, there's people from the Cruz world, the Rubio world, the Walker world, Lindsey Graham, obviously the Huckabee world, right? Sarah Huckabee Sanders was the press secretary for so long and was so excellent. So I think that's a model, because I know Reagan, followed that and believed in that, practiced that as well. And so I think that's something that we could be proud of for both administrations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that sort of brings me into my next question, which is, and Paul, we'll start with you on this one. What ways do you think that President Trump and President Reagan are similar in nature?
Yeah, from, and obviously I didn't have the inside scoop on Reagan. I unfortunately, when I came to Washington, it was just after Reagan left Washington. So I actually never laid eyes on Reagan in the flesh myself. So the only thing I know about him is through stories from folks like Ken Cribb, through history books, of course, and then just, TV. At the time I was I don't know, I guess middle school and high school coming up during the Reagan years. But the similarities that I've learned about and observed are just hiring good, conservative, principled people and putting them in positions of power and trusting them, empowering them to make key decisions. Not just around the cabinet, but all down through the layers and around the White House and the personnel office and everywhere. That personnel is policy. I think that's a huge similarity. Obviously, as you also, Jacob, mentioned in the beginning, just I think both being entertainers, by trade and training, they both understand the power of communication. You have to reach the people. You can have the greatest ideas in the world. You can even have the greatest personnel in the White House in the world. But if you're not communicating what you're doing to the American people or not hearing back from the American people as to what they think of things, what they want, you're not going to have a tremendous amount of success. So I think Reagan and President Trump exist at that kind of intersection or apex of people and ideas, that perfect blend. And understanding, I think they both did this well, that a lot of times you have to go over the heads of the media. Obviously, it's a lot easier now for President Trump to do that. Technology wasn't available back then. But even during the Reagan years, he did his very, very best to go over the heads of the media and speak directly to the people as much as possible to get an agenda, build popular support for it, and then get it enacted.
Ken?
I also associate myself with that gentleman.
We're going to agree a lot tonight, I think.
I think so. But so I'll go over a few of the policy similarities, maybe a couple of minor differences as well. Lower taxes plus deregulation promote growth. These are the levers a president has. Reagan knew it and Trump knows it. Everything else is details, and this is the big picture way to affect the American economy is through adjustment of marginal tax rates and through the level of regulation. This is significant, not just because of the prosperity of the country at large, but because this kind of growth promotes jobs. And rich people don't need jobs. It's the less fortunate that need jobs. So this is how you help the less fortunate. Both Reagan and President Trump have focused with like lasers on the question of tax rates, deregulation, and therefore growth. Also, both of them have addressed the dominant communist dictatorships of their time. Reagan, it was the Soviet Union. That's a story that's well known. Suffice it to say, there is no Soviet Union anymore. With President Trump, he's taken on China when no other American president has done so. He is pierced through the conventional wisdom that China is somehow a secret capitalist fraternity that only talks communist on when they have a big meeting. No, these are people competing with us at a very serious geopolitical level, and Trump is actually calling them on it. They both rebuilt our defenses. If you're for peace, if you want to be active on the question of diplomacy, negotiation, how do you do it? You do it if you're strong. That's the only way that people will pay attention. So both of them went through big defense buildups. And in Reagan's case, it led to 5 summits with Gorbachev. In Trump's case, he's got this amazing Israeli-Arab accord. He's got new trade agreements, both against all prognostications by the cognoscenti. With judges, we've already mentioned, but it's a big deal. So I'll throw that in. But they both got out of bad deals that their predecessors had negotiated. In President Trump's case, the Paris Climate Accords and the Iran nuclear deal. In Reagan's case, the Law of the Sea Treaty and various arms control concessions that would tie our hands behind our backs in terms of competing with the Soviets. So that's important. Guess what recent presidents haven't had foreign wars? Reagan and Trump. They were strong enough not to have foreign wars. Now, both inherited some deployments abroad, and in Trump's case, those deployments were fighting. These were people who took our defenses seriously, so seriously they haven't had to initiate wars. So those are the similarities I see, Jacob. I would say that there are differences which are less important. The differences where I think Reagan was correct. I'll mention the size of government appears to matter more to Reagan. Reagan didn't think of it as purely an economic question. He thought of it as a liberty question. And we fought a revolution because of the government's interference in the citizens of the colonists of those days. So he thought that we needed to control the actual size of government. I would say the differences where Trump is correct are on the trade deals, on getting into the minutiae, nitty-gritty of the trade deal so that the forgotten American in the Rust Belt is also remembered in this equation. I think in the conservative movement in general was too focused on the macro efficiencies of free trade, and that there were unnecessary and unacceptable human costs involved with that approach. And I think immigration is another example where President Trump is more keenly aware of the effect of open borders on those jobs in the Rust Belt and elsewhere. So I think the policy differences are much greater than the similarities are much greater. There are differences, and I think Trump is right about some of them.
No, good points.
How about, do you want to add any other differences, Paul? Or agree with the gentleman?
Yeah, I'll just stamp the agreement.
Okay. Well, so we went through their similarities and their differences. What do you think that both of their presidencies mean for the conservative movement as a whole? And we'll start with Paul on that one.
Okay. Well, I tell you what's just been so inspiring working the Trump White House is to have a president who's a fighter, right? Who made promises and didn't then immediately find excuses to not pursue those promises, right? Which is kind of the typical Washington way. You make promises during a campaign, then when you're governing, all of a sudden the excuses come out, right? Oh, you don't have this House of Congress, or you don't have 60 votes in the Senate. Now's not the right time. There's some external factors, maybe it's COVID this, civic unrest that, whatever it is. And, throughout the different years, he never took any excuses. He just said, I made promises. And in fact, if anyone who's ever been around the president while he is making decisions and hearing from multiple voices on a certain issue, it's super common for him to say, as part of this decision making, hey, was this a campaign promise? And if the answer is yes, then that's it. He's like, okay, well, then we've got to do it. We've got to pursue it. That's amazing. I mean, that's that is just a fantastic way to pursue conservative victories and conservative principles. So I think that's going to be maybe one of the most lasting impacts on the conservative movement, is to show that you can be strong on your conservative principles and push to implement them and be extremely successful. Have we gotten everything we've pushed for? Of course not. You do have certain realities, right? There is a Democrat-controlled House. There are certain pressures, obviously, from within the bureaucracy, within each agency. So I'm not trying to deny the headwinds, but at least the president has tried to keep every campaign promise, and again, met with tremendous success. And I think that's something we will hopefully see in the history books about President Trump for decades, that he was, the promise keeper.
Ken?
Well, let me then do the Reagan side of that. I think the bottom line of what Reagan did was take an intellectual movement that he was a part of and bring it to political power. I said he was the first conservative since Coolidge as president. Well, he was the first member of the conservative movement ever to become president. So this was a big deal. His conservatism as an intellectual question, it's a philosophical question, started on his own when the communists tried to take over his union. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild, and that Hollywood was an important influencer that the communists wanted to control. And they made a big move on Hollywood, and it's partly successful. And he stopped that in the Screen Actors Guild, and that woke him up about communism. He began a lifelong study of communism. By the time he was president, he was one of the great experts in the world on communism, both in theory and practice. Believe me, he was not staff dependent on the question of the Soviet Union. And so, but that with that base, he later went to GE, to General Electric, as its primary spokesman, outside spokesman. And his main associate in the GE hierarchy happened to be an ISI trustee named Mr. Lemuel Bulwer. I knew Mr. Bulwer. Ed Follner, who was on the phone, Wayne Ballas is on the phone. I know probably others. Did I say the phone? I meant this webinar. Or as Biden would probably think this is a record player, but never mind.
Nice. I love it.
In any event, Mr. Bulwer gave Reagan a reading list, and it was the ISI reading list, and it had prominent among them the libertarian economists. So I always wondered why all of a sudden you'd get a quote from Bastiat in a Reagan speech, or Albert J. Nock, or some of the 1940s, 50s libertarian economic philosophers. But that was the reason. And then finally, of course, he was a traditionalist by birth and by inclination. He grew up at his mother's knee studying the Bible. When he passed away, his mother's Bible was at his bedside table, heavily underscored and annotated in both her hand and his hand. Beyond that, he became friends with Bill Buckley. And those three strands, traditionalism, libertarianism, and anti-communism, came together in what some people have called the National Review Consensus at the hands of Bill Buckley. And so Reagan was all in. He was in with both feet. That was his conservatism. It was the intellectual conservatism of the conservative movement. And he was one of the few men of his age to sort of adopt that in midlife, as opposed to being born to it. And he completely embraced it. And as I intimated, he's the one who brought it to political power.
Actually, Jacob, if I can jump back in on the Trump side as well, a couple of points just kind of percolated as Ken was talking as well.
Sure.
I think another thing that history hopefully does show about President Trump is that, and this is the difference obviously with Reagan, is President Trump did not come naturally from the conservative movements. He wasn't kind of born and raised in the conservative movement. yet came to those principles through, of course, common sense, surrounding himself with good allies, good advisors, hearing from the people and what they most wanted, and that aligned with a conservative vision, and was able to get successes as a result by hiring good staff, putting good people around him. So in other words, taking maybe the lesson being, you don't have to necessarily be, a Ken Cribb conservative to get conservative wins as a president, that you can kind of be an immigrant, if you will, into the conservative world, but just have to have a fighting spirit, a good listening ear, and put great people around you, personnel as policy, the old slogan. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is a perfect lead in to my next question, which many people, or maybe it's not accurate, and this is what I want to ask you guys, but many people will try to wrap the Reagan legacy around Trump. So is the Donald, in many ways, the new Reagan? And is Trump advancing the ideals that Reagan advocated? And I'll start with Ken on this one.
I think this is another case where there's a facile or superficial parallelism that in real life, such things don't normally occur. I think Trump's his own man. I think there were, out of 16 candidates in the race in the Republican side, last presidential election, probably most of those would describe themselves as Reagan conservatives. And I bet Trump is the only one out of the 16 who would have won, because he broke the code on the blue states and the upper, and so he's his own man. He's got his own insights. I think that Paul is so right that he approaches the similar problems from a similar Reagan perspective. But I think that's because they both believe these things rather than he's inherited it from Reagan. So let me give Trump his own credit on that and defer to Paul.
Yeah, no, 100%. I was going to actually say the same thing, that, you don't necessarily hear every single thing that gets decided around our current White House. What would Reagan have done? Or, gee, Reagan did it that way. You don't hear too much of that because, again, the president is his own man and circumstances are different now and in so many different ways. But I think it's more the, if you will, the grander inspiration, maybe, the equivalent of the portrait on the wall kind of inspiration, the guiding vision, the guiding overarching approach to conservative governance. And I think what President Trump admires about Reagan was how Reagan was able to get deals, even when there wasn't necessarily, the betting odds in favor of a deal happening, such as the Reagan tax cuts. I think the president really admires that and looks to that. And frankly, is probably a little surprised that there aren't more deals to be found in Washington these days. It's gotten so much more polarized, and other issues we could get into. But that would be my gut as to what the president would look to Reagan for.
Right. We always forget that, Reagan actually had a Speaker of the House that sometimes, Tip O'Neill, he might have been difficult to work with sometimes, but you could still strike deals with him, unlike current occupant.
Nick, can you imagine in what universe today could there be a Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi negotiated tax cut? Right? You almost can't say the sentence without laughing, but you're right. In the 80s, it happened.
Very true. Well, I think it'd be interesting for our audience to learn, and you guys have sort of talked a little bit about this, but what were both men like to work for? And I'll start with you, Paul. What's Trump like to work for? Does he really like he is in The Apprentice? You're fine.
Right. No, not at all. It's what a lot of people don't realize when he's in meetings, and some of you on this webinar tonight know what I'm talking about. Ed Follner, Ed Meese, and others. The president is very funny. Like when you're in meetings with him, you're laughing, because he's constantly making, little references to things, putting people at ease by lighthearted comments. So it's not at all unnerving to sit in the Oval Office with Donald Trump, despite the fact that he's just a larger than life president, no question. but he puts people at ease, and he's a good listener, wants to hear. If there's someone in the room, if there are people in the room that have been brought there to make a decision, he goes person by person. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? He doesn't just kind of listen to, let's say, the chief of staff and then say, all right, I made a decision, let's walk out. He wants to hear from folks, even folks, further down the hierarchy. And it's a great testament. I also, what I've observed personally is you could tell he is just more at ease, more comfortable with regular Americans. And what I mean by that is, if we ever have an event with, coal miners at the White House, and they're there with their hard hats and, their soiled clothing, things like that, he's actually much more comfortable talking to them than he is talking to Washington politicos like me in a suit with excessive hair gel. It's amazing to watch. He is more comfortable with the regular American, and that doesn't always get conveyed properly in the media, certainly the liberal media.
Ken, what was Reagan like?
Let me just elide from Paul's remarks about the deal making. I'll start with that. Reagan was ready to deal with Gorbachev, and I had never seen the United States win a summit with the Soviet Union, so I was a skeptic. Reagan was way ahead of us on East-West, the rest of us. I mean, he was the visionary on the future of the Soviet Union. He could imagine a world without the Soviet Union that no one else on our side could believe that. And so I was skeptical of the summits because of past history. And I remember when the Washington summit occurred, Howard Baker, who was chief of staff, he had been the senator from Tennessee and the majority leader, and was thought to be something of a moderate Republican. I can tell you he was a patriot and a gentleman and a very fine man. But I was to his right, and he kept his eye on me. And he noticed that I was not at my place at the summit. And he said, "Cribb, where were you?" I said, "Senator, I've already accomplished my goals for this summit." He said, "What is that?" I said, "Not to be photographed with any known communists." So but I was wrong. And Reagan was right. And he had thought the time had come to do some Indian wrestling with Gorbachev, that he had weakened him sufficiently that the time was right for that. And over 5 summits, it turned out to be true. When I came to the White House, I agreed with Reagan's agenda for America, and I would have put up with a lot to work on that. And I was expecting the proverbial smoke-filled room. I didn't know what to expect. That's not Reagan. What I found was with Reagan and Ed Meese, his right-hand man, some people say his far right-hand man. Reagan once said that sometimes his right hand doesn't know what his far right hand is doing. but anyway, what those two gentlemen were, they were citizen politicians who wanted no more and no less than the public good. And they had a good idea of what needed to be done to get there. And that's what I found. I admired Reagan when I didn't know him and when I just knew him by reputation. After 9 years of almost daily contact with him, I admired him even more. I don't think that is an unusual thing to be able to say about any human being.
Amazing.
He provided the big ideas for us, and he did not let the minutia distract him. He pointed us in his direction, and the rest of us then worked on the implementing those ideas. And he said, as part of that management, he said he was a 9-to-5 president. Well, I'm going to tell you why that wasn't really true. But, the first thing that happened on the January 21 is the NSC types came in to say, "Now, Mr. President, we'll meet with you at 7 o'clock every morning in the Oval Office for your national security briefing." And President Reagan said, "Well, I hope you fellows have a good time because I'll be there at 9. We would get there at 9, and he would leave as soon after 5 as we could manage it. And he would go to Camp David a little early on Friday. That's when Ed Meese and I were safe. That's when we'd go down to the White House mess and have a beer together because the president couldn't call us, right? He was on the helicopter. But that was what the president was doing was he was using the 9 to 5 hour for his ceremonial and duties and policy meetings, for bringing the government along with him. You know, he had the cabinet government. He had the cabinet in the White House all the time and working on policy. And then what he did was he did his homework. He would take home with him all the memoranda and the detail work he needed to master. So he began a new workday after he got into his pajamas in the residence. And then, but unbeknownst to me, didn't find out about it until a book was published, he carried on an extensive private correspondence from the residence. It's published in a big book. I think maybe it's even 2 volumes. But so he was friendly with staff, but there was a reserve there. There was a reserve there that no one quite penetrated that, and that he basically allowed him to be imperturbable in crisis. When the rest of us were worried about what had been written about him in the Washington Post, he was the last one to be worried. You know, he just went back to those big picture concerns and worked on those. He's the only politician that I've ever worked for to make my living, and I feel very fortunate in that.
So going off of that, Ken, what do you think Reagan would say today? What do you think he would say about today's political circumstances? And what do you think? What do you think his opinion would be of Donald Trump?
He would recognize the threat of socialism. That's how he cut his teeth. You know, socialism is basically the domestic policy and social arrangements of communism. Now, communism adds a whole new level of coercion and theory, but for its economic policy, it's basically a social. This is very dangerous stuff. And the whole conservative movement, we were called individualists in those days. That was before my time. But the early conservatives were called individualists. Why? Because individualism is in opposition to socialism. So Ed Meese, as I remarked before, thinks this is the most important election of his lifetime. And I think it's because socialism has reared its head again. The stakes are huge. And we have had generations of conservatives fight on the battlefield for the freedoms that are now threatened by the reemergence of socialism. So Reagan would recognize these times and would recognize the danger of these times, and he would throw himself into the breach. That's what I think. And so I think he would love the fact, as far as President Trump is concerned, that President Trump thinks outside the box, that he's not trapped by Washington. Reagan used to say, you know, Washington is an island of illusion surrounded on all sides by reality. And so he knows that there are mirrors and smoke and mirrors at work in the federal city. So he'd love that about Trump. I think I've already said he'd love what he's doing on judges' defenses and tax cuts. But never mind all of that, he would be disciplined about his adherence to the 11th commandment. The 11th commandment, according to Reagan, was speak ill of no other Republican. So he would be in this election for President Trump's reelection with both feet. That's my feeling about it.
So you're saying he wouldn't support the Lincoln Project?
Yeah.
Paul, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just it's similar to what we were saying before. And again, I'm not trying to speak. You know, when you've got Ed Meese and Ken Cribb on here, I don't want to pretend that I know what Reagan would have thought. But again, just from historical observation, just I think the fighting spirit would have appreciated Donald Trump's fighting spirit, pushing forward despite tremendous headwinds, despite the media saying you can't do this, you can't do that, despite academia saying you can't do this, you can't do that, and despite Hollywood saying you can't do this, you can't do that, just pressing onward. Probably, I would imagine Reagan would also admire President Trump's kind of round-the-clock energy, because many of you probably get the president's public schedule, you know, as a press release emailed to you. Just know that's just little drips and drabs of what he actually does throughout the day. It starts early and it goes late into the night, and sometimes it's on the road. Like lately, obviously, it's lots of late returns from travel on the road. But even just during more normal days without as much travel, just tremendous work around the clock. It's hard to even know when the man actually sleeps. We think he does, but I'm not sure there's 100% proof of that. It's unbelievable. And in a certain respect, I think President Reagan would admire the kind of, if you will, the philosophy behind President Trump's tweeting. Every single tweet, probably not. But the notion of, as we mentioned before, going over the heads of the traditional media and speaking right to the American people so that the people know exactly what the president is thinking, doing, wanting to do, and getting that feedback. The president also reads a lot of the tweets and social media of other people out there and makes decisions accordingly. I think President Reagan would appreciate that philosophy of kind of saying the traditional media really just isn't that necessary, especially now. I think he would appreciate that.
Well, that brings up an interesting point, Paul, and I'll direct this at Ken. Do you think that President Reagan would have used social media if he would have had it available in the 80s to use?
Well, look, let me give you a piece of evidence as to that. He personally brought back into vogue, or rather into current practice, the fireside chat by radio. That was Reagan's idea, and he loved it. It was his way of speaking directly to the people. Well, radio, remember that when Reagan made that decision, that was just before talk radio took off and became hugely powerful. So early radio, early in the explosion of talk radio, one of the great practitioners was Ronald Reagan himself. Yep. And he had actually done this even after he was governor of California for a number of years. And the radio casts from those days were found in the Hoover archives, which later became the Reagan Library Archives, and by a scholar. And a book was published by Martin Anderson and Kyron Skinner called Reagan in His Own Hand. And what it proved was that far from being the amiable dunce that Clark Clifford was talking about, here was Reagan dealing with the most sophisticated policy issues of the day in his own handwriting, so nobody can dispute that he was actually doing. So yes, I think he would use social media because he did use what was available to him. He was a master of television. When I saw him make his announcement in Aden for the presidency, and he was speaking, of course, to the cameras, I thought, oh my gosh, that wasn't a fiery speech. Of course it wasn't. It was because Reagan understood how he was looking on the medium of television. So as a professional communicator who earned his living in Hollywood, I think he would have been an early adopter.
Nice. Well, Paul, there's a question here from the audience. I think this is perfect for you.
Okay.
How has the influence of the swamp changed between Reagan and Trump, if it has changed significantly?
Wow. I mean, I think you almost have to say it's changed, if for no other reason than the mere size, right? I mean, the growth of the bureaucracy, the growth of government between the 80s and the 2020s has, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, and unfortunately for bipartisan reasons, has really exploded. And so I think I'd imagine the ratio of swamp creature or bureaucrat to political appointee in any agency is probably much greater now, and therefore more potent. They have more levers now to slow things down. And we've seen that with some of our allies throughout the various agencies, where the president could even make a direct order, like, I want this policy, I want this executive order drafted. And you've got career, civil servants who do everything they can to slow walk it, block it, change it, delay it, even though they have a direct order from the president of the United States. Ken may correct me, but I don't think that was either as common or as easy in the 80s, just because there were fewer of those folks by comparison to now. So I think that's a big part of it. Also, another big part of it, this is maybe the flip side of social media. It's even easier to leak now, right? Every individual government employee at any level has the ability to just grab that document off the printer or get it emailed or whatever and just tweet it out, email it to a reporter, post it up somewhere on a website. There's just so many different and newer ways for everyone at all levels to get things out that will slow down a rulemaking process, a deregulation, things along those lines. So again, we're curious to hear Ken's thoughts on that, but that's just a guess of the differences there.
Yeah, sure, Ken.
No, I don't have much to add to that. I think that analysis is correct. The president has somewhere around 3,500 senior political appointments he can make out of a huge federal government. And so taking hold of that is hard. And in our case, we had 8 years to do it, and it was a continuing struggle. In President Trump's case, he has something called the resistance. Until the last election, we had the loyal opposition. Now we have the resistance. And this is unheard of, where the opposing political party would seek to block the president filling the administration with people to do the work of the people. It is a scandal and it needs to be called out.
No question. And we've even had examples of, again, career civil servants who technically work for the president of the United States, right? Even if they're not political, still in the executive branch, but they will take something they don't like, maybe an early draft of an executive order, of a rulemaking, of a letter, a guidance document, and literally just leak it out with the intention of killing it, harming it, embarrassing the folks who are working on it. It's an incomplete document. It's a draft, right? But who wants their unperfected drafts on anything out there? I wouldn't want my grocery list imperfected out there. But they do that to harm the president, harm the administration, slow down the process. So that's been a real hindrance throughout these last 3 3/4 years. No question.
Do you think that's something, Paul, that will improve or get worse in a possible second Trump term?
Well, I think we've already taken very recent steps actually to help improve it. I don't know if you saw this last week. Fantastic initiative. If you haven't seen it, I'll send you the link after we're done. You can send it around. But the very unsexy term is a Schedule F executive order from last year. And in English, what that basically means is through executive order last week, the president said that it's about 10,000 or so career employees, federal employees, civil servants can be designated agency by agency as a Schedule F, which means they're going to be treated like politicals if they work in policymaking roles. That means more accountability. That means easier to fire if they're a low performer, that kind of thing. So right there, we've got a very recent good step that obviously we won't really feel its effects in the next few months. I think there's kind of a 90-day ramp up runway, if you will, for each agency to say, okay, here's who we would want to designate Schedule F, and here's why, and all that. So this is something for term 2. And
before I get into more questions, I'd just like to tell those students that are watching tonight that tonight's event is just a taste of what ISI offers student members. If you are tired of progressive orthodoxy on campus and eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom, then learn the timeless principles of liberty with ISI. When you become a member of ISI, we'll introduce you to the American tradition of liberty and to a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education and a community they don't find at their universities. And in the process, they become articulate voices for conservative principles. So to get the college education you deserve, you can become a student member of ISI today at join.isi.org. That's join.isi.org. So jump back into questions here. What was the most memorable moment for each of you in working in these administrations? And I'll start with Ken.
Jacob, something that comes to mind is still very fresh in my mind. The image was the swearing in of Justice Scalia in the East. It was sort of the culmination of so much work to re-theorize the Constitution's jurisprudence to return to its original conception. It was a gift from, the opportunity was a gift from Chief Justice Berger. Chief Justice Berger told Ed Meese about a year in advance that he wouldn't be leaving. And the secret held because Ed only told 3 other people. If you tell more than 3 people, you're in trouble. But he told the president, I knew about it. And he told the president, and then Brad Reynolds knew about it. If they're more than that, I didn't know about it. Possibly the president told someone. But in any event, we had a year to work on it. Ed Meese set up a committee. Each member of the committee became a specialist on the potential justice. And there were 22. We even did some opposition research. A couple of people we did not want to be on there. We researched them too. And the conclusion of this year of careful research was by far the head and shoulders candidates were Bork and Scalia. And so Ed Meese would be the last one to narrow a proper decision away from the president. We sent both names over. And Brad Reynolds, who was a member of that committee, in fact, he was chairman of that committee, and I, as counselor, we were with Ed when he left for the White House to take those 2 names over at 9:00. And that meeting would have ended by 10:00. So we didn't even move. We stayed right there in that office waiting to see what news Ed would bring back. And Ed came back and he said 2 things. He says it's going to be Scalia for Associate Justice, and then we'll elevate Rehnquist into the vacancy created by Berger's retirement as Chief Justice. Rehnquist being one of the most conservative members of the court. This was excellent news. And the president further, although it's not generally known, further intended to do Bork for the next vacancy, which he did. So it was win-win-win. And so 10:00 in the morning, Brad Reynolds was a teetotaler. He had not had a drink in 25 years. I reached into the closet, grabbed the sherry, poured out 3 goblet glasses of sherry. And we toasted the president and Scalia, drank the sherry down, 10 in the morning, Ed Meese, Brad Reynolds, myself. Brad's eyes were this big. I said, "What's wrong, Brad? You didn't think Ed could pull this off?" I said, "It's not that. I haven't had a drink in 25 years, and it's 10 a.m.
Fantastic.
How about you, Paul?
Oh, well, I got to tell you, and I know this, I'll give you a real answer, but the true answer that I want to give is there are so many I can hardly pick, especially when you're still right in it, right? It's hard to step back and look back and say whatever. Having said that, let me give you 3 quick ones. I know you picked one, but I promise to be fast. One was the day we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. Ed Follner was there, actually. The Rose Garden was just filled. It was a sea of conservatives that I had helped invite some of them, and others that brought this just row after row of conservatives to watch this fantastic move where the president announced a just full and immediate withdrawal from the onerous Paris Climate Accords, which was so different than the way Washington would normally do something like that, right? Even if they wanted, to pull out of an agreement like that, it maybe would be announced on that day, but it doesn't take effect for a year in advance. And even then, it's only 25% wound down. And a year later, it's 50% wound down. Like, there would be some reason. And then, of course, somewhere along that wind down period, someone would undo it and get us fully back to the Paris Climate Accords. We would have never actually gotten out. The president said, "No way. I promised I was going to get out. It's a horribly anti-American agreement. Totally unfair. We're pulling out today. Done. 100% complete." And to do that in front of a sea of conservatives in the Rose Garden, that's memory is going to stick with me for a while. Second thing, speaking of a sea of conservatives and allies, this was just a few weeks ago, the announcement of the Abraham Accords on the South Lawn of the White House. Those are the peace agreement between Israel and Bahrain, and Israel and the United Arab Emirates, with the Trump administration, of course, negotiating and mediating. Just sitting there and watching that, watching Arab leaders and Jewish leaders embrace, watching Arab leaders say nice things about Jewish people and vice versa. And to have this happen with not one country, but with two countries at once, United Arab Emirates and Bahrain at once, and knowing that there were others in the works, as we've seen, Sudan, and there are others coming soon. That was just an amazing moment, and just one that I will take with me for decades. And the last one, this isn't as public but meaningful. I just wanted to share it with everybody. This was, I believe, and I'm going to forget the exact year. I think it was 2019. I have no sense of time anymore. Time is so dense, I can't even figure out what year it was. But I think it was last year, Black History Month. We were having a celebration in the East Room of the White House. And I just had one of those kind of out-of-body experiences, looking around at a sea of allies, obviously Black folks, but also non-Black folks, all sharing in the celebration of Black History Month. And what really struck me was, it hit me with the East Room was where President Abraham Lincoln lay in state after he was assassinated. And just that historical juxtaposition of, here we are in the room where a president lay in state who was assassinated for basically trying to bring equality to Black people. And here we are, fast forward, 100 plus years in the same room, celebrating the tremendous successes of Black Americans and other Americans under this president. And it just that's another moment that I will take with me for many decades.
Well, so that actually leads into my next question, Paul. How do you think history is going to judge President Trump, regardless of whether he secures a second term?
Yeah, it's a good question, because let's face it, we have to make sure conservatives write that history. And I think that's why ISI is so important. You're training young leaders of folks who will be writing that history when, guys like me with the gray hairs coming in are long gone. Your ISI folks and alums and offspring will be writing that history. And what I think they will write is that, again, here was a man who made promises and fought every single day to keep them or to try to keep them. And we met with tremendous success across every possible arena. That's the thing. We didn't just have economic success, but failed in the social or national security arenas. We had successes all across every possible issue area. And the ones that we haven't had successes on, we either kept trying or you find other ways. Perfect example, right? A promise was to fully repeal Obamacare. We gave that a shot, really big, sustained, long time shot. Didn't work out. But instead of the president saying, well, okay, stinks for me, he said, okay, how can we chip away at Obamacare? For example, repealing the individual mandate we got as part of the tax cut bill. Regulations that made it easier to get out of government, Obamacare plans, choose your own plans, to come together as private organizations and buy private insurance together. Other ways of getting out from under Obamacare. Just examples of ways to keep, that he kept his promises, even if the immediate promise wasn't able to be met. So I think that's going to be a huge part of the history. I think the tweeting has to be part of the history, because it's just such a direct line in real time. I mean, that's another thing. If you look back through history, how many American citizens through all of our history could know what the president of the United States is thinking many times a day in real time? Unbelievable, right? I mean, even presidents during the TV age, they can know what their president is thinking if the CBS Evening News put a clip about the president in there, or if, the president gave a rare televised address to the nation kind of thing. But minute to minute, multiple times a day, to know what the president is doing and thinking and working on and seeking advice on is something that I think will show up in the history books for many, many generations.
Ken, would you like to comment?
Well, I think this was properly addressed to Paul. I agree with Paul. I think he's had plenty of accomplishments to have been done over 8 years. Whether or not there is a term, he has. It's chock full of accomplishments. We've listed many of them between Paul and myself in the last hour. One thing that will be, I believe, lasting beyond his time. Of course, judges always last beyond.
Oh yes,
right. And so that's a big one, but we've discussed that. The whole question of the press as an institution and how it serves a democracy and whether or not it is honest, it hasn't been for a long time, but it had not been called out to the extent that it needed to be. And that was true under the Reagan days. Reagan went over their heads and exerted a charm and magnetism that they didn't understand. They called him the Teflon president because they didn't understand it. But his way of dealing it would not have been adequate for this press corps that we have here now. And I think that the fact that the confidence in the press or the approval of the press, however that question is asked, is in the teens, is very valuable to the future of the republic, because we need to know when a press corps is in the pocket of one of the two political parties. That is something that needs to be known. And who has made it clear with that famous moniker, the fake press? Donald Trump. And so let's give him some credit for that. And I think it will last beyond his time. It will, I believe, lead to the reform of the press, to some attempt to revive a true journalism. And any democracy needs that. So let's hope that happens.
Okay. Well, so Paul, let's look forward to a second Trump term. And someone asked, the startup of people in Donald J. Trump's first term was much slower than it was with Ronald Reagan. Hope springs again that in a second Trump term, we'll get rid of more of the swamp. Thoughts?
Absolutely. 100%. First of all, just, dial back, a few minutes ago to that Schedule F thing we talked about. So right there, we've got a kind of an in-process, very significant effort to continue draining the swamp. But more importantly, I understand the questioner's larger point. I think in 2016, and this is not me speaking out of school, I think really anyone would admit this, because the entire political class and beyond thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And as we talked about it earlier, I made a career move based on what we thought Hillary Clinton and how we thought she was going to win. There wasn't a tremendous amount of personnel preparation. There was some, no question. I want to give credit to the Heritage Foundation, Ed Fulner, and so many others who did have great work ready to go. But I think a lot of folks in the immediate Trump orbit, because they weren't necessarily thinking, hey, we're taking the reins of power really soon, there wasn't enough of that work done. That's not true now. There is plenty of work and much more work being done as we speak, preparing for personnel in a second term, a hopeful second term. No one's jinxing anything, but they just say, look, you've got to be ready for both scenarios, win or lose. We lose, we don't need any personnel for the second term. But let's be ready if, God willing, we get that second term, and we think we will. So there's much more preparation for personnel efforts, not only removal of the ongoing bureaucrats that we talked about before who were trying to hamper the president's agenda, but further placements of great principled movement conservatives throughout the administration, because there'll be natural turnover at the end of any administration, no matter how much you like your current job. Sometimes some people say, hey, my spouse is telling me I need to go make more money, so I love this job, but I'm headed off to the corporate world. That'll leave openings, and we got to fill them with conservatives, and we're preparing to do that. Literally, as we speak, right before this webinar, I was sending people some resumes of good conservatives to hold on to. So it's underway.
Great. Ken, someone asked, this is directed towards you, in what ways do you think Reagan would have handled current heated issues like race relations and the COVID-19 pandemic?
The AIDS pandemic hit when Reagan was president. And so, these are tough matters. They're not susceptible to political will or persuasion, right? They are. It's a matter of the hard science and what you have to do about it. So, having addressed the AIDS issue in those days, with, by the way, Tony Fauci, who was already the Centers for Disease Control in those days and in a senior position. I think there's evidence Reagan would be prepared for something like the pandemic and would attend to it. The other thing about race relations, he would have seen through facial claims about racial injustice and quote, systemic racism, and get to what the real nub is, to what the actual injustices might be, and address them. Because as we know, unfortunately, for every legitimate claim, there's a charlatan who will make an illegitimate claim. And I don't mean a penny ante charlatan, I mean people who mean this country harm. Because this question of systemic injustice, what are we talking about with systemic injustice? Systemic racism? What are we talking about? Systemic racism. America, United States of America. It is a veiled attack on a country that has produced more justice and more wealth than any country we can name. And that's generally known. That is not an issue that is seriously disputed. So he would have understood this as a matter that would have to be addressed, not through pandering to it, but through hard analysis to get to the bottom of it. There are obviously things that happen that shouldn't. Knock them hard. Get to those. If there's somebody who has performed a criminal act of injustice, put them in jail for a long time, punishment. But do not, for example, disable police departments that are trying to help minority communities protect themselves from predators, right? Don't wall off a section of a city where it's a free fire zone and people are murdered. You don't have to, you can't be completely sentimental about a claim of injustice because people die when you're sentimental. While you're feeling good about how sentimental and how patting yourself on the back about how virtuous you are, people die.
Yes. No. Right. Ken or Paul, would you like to add anything?
No, that's good. That's perfect.
I thank the audience member for that question. I think it's a very timely question, especially, ISI, we're here in Wilmington, Delaware, and just up the road in Philadelphia, the past few nights, the violence we've seen on the streets. I think that's a very timely and important question. So I thank the audience member for that. Here's another one from the audience. And this is, they said this is from the 50-year skunk. So I'll let you determine, Ken, who that is. But it says Reagan was reelected by 17 million votes, winning the Electoral College 525 to 13. Conservatives now face unsettling prospects next Tuesday night. We may be succeeded by the most left-wing administration in history. The Senate may be lost to the most left-wing bunch of Democrats ever. Is this due to COVID, or has President Trump's unique personality rubbed so many people the wrong way? And I guess I'll start with Paul on this one.
Yeah, no, I would just say frankly, this has been building for years, and if anyone truly looks at what's been going on in the Democrat Party, frankly, even since I've been on the Hill, which for me was 2000, so 20 years ago, was when I've had my first Capitol Hill job. And there were legitimate Democrat moderates then. I mean, legitimate, actual moderates, actually middle of the road people who happen to have Democrat by their name, either for historical reasons or their state, or they did have some liberal viewpoints that they generally agreed with. But you could work with them. And there were more divisions within the Democratic Party, which frankly worked to our advantage a lot of time. Over these last 20 years, I think you're seeing a more and more extreme Democrat Party, much more unified as a result, right? I mean, obviously, there's always human infighting amongst any group of anybody, but are there true, genuine moderates left in the Democrat Party? Is there anyone who's not going to vote for Nancy Pelosi if Democrats retain the House? Is there anyone who's going to put up any sort of rebellion, the equivalent of what conservatives did for less than conservative speakers over the years, that kind of thing. It just doesn't exist. The party has moved to the extremes, and they're getting electorally rewarded for it for some reason. That's something that maybe is above my pay grade, and others can jump in as to why that is. But I think the reason you're seeing what you're seeing at the national level is because that's where the party has gone. That's what the party has demanded within itself. And actually, a perfect example is Joe Biden, who is not nearly as liberal, was not nearly as liberal in the past as he appears to be now. And again, I think that's due to these changing pressures from within Democrat circles.
Ken?
No, I think that was well stated.
A lot of agreement tonight. That's good.
Next time, have AOC on here, and we'll have some.
Well, we'll have her. If we're all about debate here at ISI, so we'll have her for sure. I doubt she'd accept our invitation.
But you never know.
This is a great question. This is a perfect question for ISI, so I'll direct this one to Ken. What is your outlook about the future of the conservative Western civilization movement, considering our government-controlled K through 12 schools and universities are awash in cultural Marxism?
Mm.
Yes, it's gotten worse. It's hard to believe it's gotten worse because it was already bad. And you're seeing the effects of it in younger people. The good news about that is the younger people become older people, and become mugged by reality, as someone once said. But I see hopeful signs in world events, including America. The rejection of the establishment in the 2016 election, the Brexit vote in England, the fact that the proto-socialist government of Europe, which is unelected and uncorrectable in Brussels, is barely holding on to that kind of insult to the body politic, I think is a sign that common sense can reoccur. I also think that what we're seeing with the violence in the cities, which is, organized nationally, paid for nationally, and which can be turned on and off depending on what the election cycle is demanding, is going too far. I think there will be a reaction to that, which is a common sense reaction, and it's going to be to say, you know what, my part of the American dream does not need to be hostage to Molotov cocktails and broken windows and looting. So I think they're going too far, Jacob, and I think the future is susceptible to a brighter day. I'm optimistic about it. I know it sounds like perverse to say that at a moment like this, but out of this kind of overreach, totalitarian movements are exposed to the ordinary man and woman, and the ordinary man and woman rejects totalitarianism.
Yes. Well said, Ken. Paul, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree with the overreach points. Perfect example is the violence, right? The civil unrest, I think, is just that perfect example of, a left-wing movement that if it had just kept itself to words, right, may have actually built more support, scary as that could be. As soon as they have now turned to destroying businesses, going against the police, destroying people's American dreams, that they overreached. And there's a snapback effect. And frankly, I think politically, the president has benefited from that. We, of course, would never wish for violence. But given that that's where the left went, clearly the snapback, I think the average American is looking at that and saying, if that's what the Democrats are okay with, because remember the Democrats over the summer went 4 days of their national convention, no mention of this violence, nothing for 4 days. They didn't mention it. So I think a lot of kind of independent-minded, moderate, suburban female voters are looking at that and they're like, yeah, that's not the vision, of America that I want. But also super quick, I think why there is hope for America, despite Marxism in the schools and other forms of left-wing ideologies. Well, for one, we've got groups like ISI, and that's why you guys need to grow and thrive and do even more. But also, I think with the increase in resources, right? The average student, the average child has the ability to get information from so many more different places, right? In the old days, if you heard something from your teacher and it was emphasized by the textbook you were using, that was kind of it. That was the gospel. You couldn't challenge that, and there was no other way to challenge it. Now, a student can kind of look at a teacher, that doesn't sound right, or read the textbook, it doesn't sound right. Go get other competing sources of information right there in class, on the phone, or after school at their laptop at home, or wherever else. So, I mean, it's that's power, and I think that's going to help kids learn their way out of some of the nonsense that's being taught in colleges. Having said that, again, we do need groups like ISI to make sure they know the difference between Marxism and capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul. That's why we record these, so we can have.
Hey, just send the royalty checks to my house here. That's fine.
Well, on a more lighthearted note, so what are both of you most proud of during your tenures within administrations? And I'll start with you, Paul.
Oof, what am I most proud of? God, man, that's a great question. I guess maybe just for me, the overall pride comes with just having a job when I was in legislative affairs and currently with the vice president, always having a job that every day my focus is the conservative movement, liaisoning back and forth, two-way communication, letting the conservative world know what the administration is doing or wants to do, but also absorbing what the conservative movement is thinking, likes, dislikes, what it wants to do, its vision, its agenda, and making sure that's heard throughout the administration from the highest levels, all the way on down. That's, for me, a tremendous source of pride, being kind of at that apex of this two-way communication between the conservative movement and the White House and the administration. That's what tremendous honor, tremendous privilege. I want to get 4 more years out of it, so hope that starts very soon. But yeah, I would say that's, for me, the greatest pride is just the everyday job that I've got. It's really fantastic.
How about you, Ken? After 8 years with Reagan.
I'll address that, but first let me say, Paul, that it is a pleasure to work with you, for all of us from the outside. And your predecessor under Reagan, the man in charge of conservative outreach for Reagan, Wayne Ballas, is on this webinar. And so there's a certain continuity there.
We love it. He's a great man.
Absolutely.
And you both answered a question, but from Mr. Ballas. So there you go.
That's right. I guess it would be the thing I worked on in the most sustained way was judicial selection. My boss, Ed Meese, was on the White House committee. So even when Justice was doing all this work, we actually met only a few steps from the Oval Office to make the final decisions. And he got me in on those meetings, and I helped staff him on that. And then there came a time when he became Attorney General, and I did his transition. I then reorganized judicial selection at Justice. And then the third venue was when I went back to the White House for Iran-Contra. They asked me to stay, the rest of the term. And the only thing I asked for was to go on the Judicial Selection Committee. So I worked on it in a sustained way for 8 years, not counting the campaign, 9 years if you count the campaign. So I think that's what I'm proudest of. I think that one thing that was accomplished, not by me, but by the Reagan administration and the Meese Justice Department and the Bill Smith Justice Department, by the way, which was excellent, before Ed became Attorney General. I think for the first time, having a theory of the Constitution that will allow us to judge whether a judicial candidate will be a good judge or a bad judge. It didn't exist before Reagan. We had slogans before Reagan, like judicial restraint was a slogan. States' rights was a slogan, that kind of thing. It had no intellectual content, and therefore it was not helpful. The judge would come in and say, I believe in judicial restraint. Fine, you can be a judge. No, that doesn't give you any predictability or insights. So Robert Bork gave us the intellectual predicate to form a theory of the Constitution called originalism that allowed us to put a case to a judicial candidate so that he didn't know the answer. He didn't know what the right answer was. What we were really looking at was how would he rule? How would he judge? How would he act as a judge? What Bork did for us was isolate the role of the judge in democratic theory. Judges have to obey the law just like Paul and just like Jacob and just like Ken, right? But that was not the consensus in 1980 when Reagan was elected. Right. Judges were remaking the law every time they sat down. And that has changed. And even Democrats who go before the Judiciary Committee now have to say they believe in the text of the Constitution. Now, they may not mean it, but they have to say it. So I would say that what we call originalism now, which means that you obey the law as it is written until the law is changed by the people, is a very potent contribution of the Reagan days that President Trump has maximized to full advantage.
And, Jacob, if I could jump back in real quick.
Sure.
As we were sitting here, in the voice in my head was like, tell her your answer was a little bit of a cop-out. Come up with something. So as we're sitting here, I am thinking of one more specific moment of pride. And yes, I have the pride for the overall job. But here's one specific quick story. A few years ago, helped kind of push this effort, draft the letter, and then deliver it. It was the letter where President Trump sent to the Hill a promise in writing that if you weaken any pro-life protections, I will veto that entire bill. And that was great. And again, to be able to help get that to reality, even the editing process and all of that. And then because I was in legislative affairs at the time, I was the one who got the actual copy to deliver it up to the Hill, walked into Nancy Pelosi's office. She wasn't there, unfortunately. I had to give it to a staffer, but still, it was a great moment to walk into her office and say, here you go, it's from President Trump, promising to veto bills that weaken pro-life protections. Great moment, and very Trumpian, because again, it was just like, you do this, I do that, done. So it's a great moment.
I'm sure she would have enjoyed receiving that from you personally.
Absolutely.
Well, we probably have several students joining us this evening that might be interested in serving in an administration down the road, perhaps even a second term of President Trump. What advice would you offer those students who are considering professional opportunities in the executive branch? And I guess I'll start with you, Paul, because you were just talking about resumes.
Okay. Yeah, I would actually say don't wait. Sharpen up that resume now. If you haven't looked at it recently, pull it out, make sure it looks good, make sure it's complete, and start working it now. And by working it, frankly, I think ISI is a great bridge because, yeah, there's official portals where you could submit your resumes. I got to tell you, knowing friends on the inside, they don't look at the official submissions all that much, to be honest. Wink, wink between you and me. They're much more likely to look at resume submissions that come in through personal contacts, through someone like me currently on the inside. So meaning like, if you're interested and you want to get your resume, to Jacob, who then gets it to me, who gets it to the personnel office right now, that's going to be a more effective way. And I would say, even if you don't know exactly where you want to be, the White House, an agency, do you want to be a comms guy? Do you want to be an outreach coalitions person? Doesn't matter. Just get the resume in, have people start looking at it here for vetting purposes to see, hey, where would this person fit in and get yourself in the system so that, again, hopefully we have a term 2 starting soon and you're already ahead of the game when other people maybe in January are going to first think, hey, maybe I should give this a shot. You'll be ahead of the game if you've started now in October and November.
Ken?
Well, let me address then the other situation of in the future, a new presidency, because obviously the resume, which points out the good accomplishments academically, but also in job experience, that goes without saying. And then when a new presidency is coming in, volunteer. And by the way, don't worry about whether you're being paid or not. That's not the point. And if young people can normally make arrangements where they can accept unpaid jobs, and so don't worry, because the best way to I did it myself. I told you the story, but just go in and say I'll just go to work, and the earlier the better, because it's an indication of the level of your commitment to that candidate. So before the convention is better than after the convention. After the convention is better than during the transition. But get that credential. And if none of those avenues work, even try the inaugural committee. But get a credential that will get you noticed. Because I agree with Paul, the macro systems don't work that well in the hurly-burly of a brand new administration. And you need to have a way of calling attention to yourself. And that's good old-fashioned networking through some of the means that I described.
100%.
Oh, by the way, an alternative route, because not everybody can get involved that way, an alternative route is a good relationship with a conservative policy outfit when it's a Republican candidacy you're looking for. Heritage Foundation, great credential, that kind of thing.
No question. If I get a resume, maybe I've never heard the person's name, I don't even necessarily understand where the person worked. It's for different organizations. I don't know, but it comes from Heritage. It comes from ISI. It comes from wherever else, a conservative, trusted outfit. That's enough. I'll pass that along to allies in the personnel office and say, hey, this comes recommended by Heritage. Take a serious look at this guy. So yeah, absolutely right.
So for both of you, and we're getting short on time, just really quickly, what should one expect if they join an administration? Paul, we'll start with you. Or Ben. No, we can start with you.
I tell you, I'm going to be brief. I can just tell, because just give you, you'll be posed with this dilemma, whether to accept the fact that only one person has been elected president and the rest of us are dependent appointees of his, and to be loyal to that vision and that agenda, and not to play games. That's one road you can take. The other road you can take is to be opportunistic and try to, soften the way you will appear when you're back in the job market after you leave the administration. Your bosses are not idiots. They'll figure that out. Opportunism just doesn't work. And I'm not, I think that all I'm saying is, I don't expect there to be a single opportunist in this audience, but I'm saying that's a temptation you'll be confronted with. Paul, do you see my point?
Yeah, 100%. And, a kind of corollary to that is be nice to everybody, right? Because you just don't know, the person you're rude to now, may suddenly be above you or someone you need in a certain position later on in the administration or in life in some other job. So yeah, I always advise just be as nice as possible to everybody. Help them. Don't make it like, what could they do for me? Make it what you can do for your colleagues, for the vice president, for the president. Of course, that's who you're there for. They're the ones that got elected. We didn't. So you're exactly right, Ken. And I guess I would also say, just be ready to work and go above and beyond, right? The folks who excel the fastest, who grow the fastest, or the ones who, don't clock in at 9:01 and out at 4:59, that have longer days of service to the cause, and make sure you are there for a cause, not for a job. Do you know what I'm saying? There's a difference there, and at least the job is a means to advancing your principles, advancing the cause, and treat it that way. And so, if you treat it that way, you won't look at the clock, and yes, you will be willing to stay late when needed, or go out to that evening reception, even though you want to just hit the couch and catch the Bachelorette. But you know that it's better for the administration if you do hit that certain event, represent the administration well, make contacts, get information, and report back the next day. So yeah, just be that person who goes above and beyond. You'll get noticed, and you'll make a bigger difference.
So to close things out, if you taking into consideration all of that, and as you noted, Paul, the long hours, the constantly changing work schedules, and the insane amount of work, would you choose to do it again if you had the opportunity to do so?
I know I would, absolutely. And part of that is because I'm probably unemployable outside of this world. So like, I don't know what else I would actually do. No, I absolutely love it. It's been a tremendous honor, every job along the way. And certainly these White House jobs have just been unbelievable privilege. I still walk around, even though it's been almost 4 years, I still walk around kind of like one of these guys, looking up like, oh my God, I get to be here. Oh my God, I'm walking in the colonnade with the Rose Garden. Oh my God, I'm standing 3 feet from the Vice President of the United States. I mean, it keeps hitting me, even though it's been this long. And so if you always have that kind of servant leader, humble attitude, I think that will take you far.
Ken, how about you?
I would just piggyback on what Paul said about the honor of it. I left just a little bit before President Reagan, and we exchanged remarks in the Roosevelt room. Mm-hmm. And what I said to him that day was that whatever the future holds, the 8 years with him would be the proudest and most privileged part of my life. Nothing has happened since to make me change my mind. I would do it over again in a heartbeat.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great place to close it, a very hopeful place to close it. So I want to thank Ken and Paul for joining us tonight. I hope that their testimonials have inspired some of our students and those in their early careers to possibly consider a role in a future administration if given the opportunity. And I'd like to thank all of our attendees. I want to encourage everyone to tune in for our next episode of Conservative Conversations on Wednesday, November 4th, day after the election, where we'll be talking with Matt Continetti about what the future holds for the conservative movement after the election. You can find more info on the event on www.isi.org. So thank you again to everyone for participating tonight, and I hope everyone enjoys the remainder of their evening, and thank you.